Now we come now to the British Nutrition Foundation annual lecture. And this lecture is given every year by our previous BNF Prize winner. And last year, this prestigious award was given to Dr. Alison Tedstone for her distinguished contribution to public health research and her work for 2 years at the highest levels within government, ensuring that diet, nutrition and obesity were central to nutrition policy making. Alison retired from the Department of Health and Social Care in March of this year. While she was there, she was the chief nutritionist and led on nutrition programs such as the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, scientific advice, including the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, and actions to improve diet and to promote physical activity. Her team led work aimed at tackling obesity, and Alison worked closely, and maybe I should say navigated a rather careful line between science and policy on this very difficult area of obesity. Over the years, Alison led technical support to UK actions on improving diet, including salt reformulation, which I think is one of our great successes, front-of-pack labelling, controls on TV advertising, and numerous expert reports on, for example, folic acid, salt, carbohydrates, iron, and vitamin D. Alison is a registered public health nutritionist and a fellow of the Association for Nutrition. She has honorary fellowships from the Nutrition Society and from the Royal Colleges of Physicians and Pediatrics and Child Health. She is a member of the WHO Nutrition Guidance Expert Advisory Group on Policy Actions. She chairs the Osteoporosis Guidelines Committee for NICE and is also president of the Association for Nutrition. So, a very worthy winner of last year's award, and we're looking forward to your lecture, Alison. As is tradition, after the lecture, there will be no questions. So it's my honor to invite Alison to deliver her annual lecture. And her lecture will be on tackling inequalities in diet, a 20-year perspective. Alison.
Thank you very much. I think John gave a little slip there because he said 2 years. It's been a 20-year thing in nutrition in government. But it's a huge honour to do this, and I'm particularly delighted to be speaking at a meeting that's dedicated to improving the diets of those suffering the worst diets in our country. So I'm going to take a 20-year perspective, and I'm going to think about what has changed in terms of diet, and also if the various policies that have happened over the last 20 years have had any impact on diets overall and diets for those who suffer the greatest dietary inequalities in our population. And I'm going to muse then on what we might need to do to change the dial a bit on this. So thank you very much. So I've talked about that one. So this is what we want. We want motherhood and apple pie. We want the nation to be consuming a diet that is healthy, that is based on fruit and vegetables, contains lots of high fiber foods, and very few of these high salt, fat, sugar foods that we love to consume. And we want to be consuming an amount of energy that sustains a healthy body weight. This is not what the population is doing. I'm just going to come back to some data that Karina talked about earlier. This is data from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. It's the most recent cut of data, but it shows much the same that I have seen throughout my whole career in nutrition, including the 20 years in academia before I joined the civil service. So we see a population that consumes too much saturated fat. We know that increases the risk of heart disease. Too much sugar, increasing the risk of excess calorie intake and being really bad for our teeth. Too little fiber, increasing the risk of multiple diseases. Too much salt and too few fruit and veg. I haven't got micronutrients up here, but there are other micronutrient problems that are there written large, but stem from not eating that diet that I showed on the first slide, not eating that healthy, balanced diet that one of the speakers this morning said, we all know what that is, but we don't eat it. So thinking about low-income groups, the National Diet and Nutrition Survey has published an assessment of how diet varies with income. This looked at income across NDNS participants' household income. And you can see here that, yes, fruit and vegetable intake varies with income, that low-income groups have a lower fruit and veg intake than the higher income groups. But the slope of this line is very shallow. Income is affecting fruit and veg intake, is associated with lower levels of fruit and veg intake, but not to a huge extent. So in this analysis, every £10,000 of additional income was associated with a 0.2 grams, 13 grams, 0.2 portions increase in fruit and veg. That's pretty small. It's pretty small. And these are data for sugary drinks, and we see again higher levels of sugary drinks in low-income participants. But again, the slope is really quite flat. So income isn't affecting sugary drinks intake that much. And indeed, it's the same for sugar intake, just there is an effect of income, but again, very small. So when we look at the overall analysis of the NDNS according to income, we see an effect. We see an overall effect, but it is quite small. So low-income groups do have a worse start than higher-income groups, but it's of quite a low order of magnitude. So addressing dietary inequalities would be really good, and we saw some brilliant talks on that this morning, but it would not have an overwhelming effect on the nation's diet. The nation, if we did away with dietary inequalities completely, we would still see the nation having a really poor diet. And that is really important to remember, that actually it's everybody that's affected by this. I always have very mixed views when politicians used to talk to us, ask us to explain the diets of low-income people to them, because in a way that creates a sense of the other. If we could just tackle the diets of those people over there, shout at them very loudly and get them to eat their fruit and veg, then everything would be okay. And what the NDNS shows us is it wouldn't. It would have some effect. Well, shouting won't work. I can't do that. It would have some effect, but it would not have a massive effect on the nation's diet. It would still overwhelmingly be bad. So the next question I want to think about is what's happened over my 20-year career in the civil service. Have diets got better or worse on average? And have they got better or worse for people living in poverty? And that should be a really easy thing to address because we're privileged in the UK, we have lots of data. But it isn't, that question actually is harder than you think to address. And it's because we've changed our methodologies over the years. So we've shifted our surveys around over the years because we've always sought to improve them. We've changed the way we measure some nutrients over the years because of changes in scientific advice, development of lab methods. And also we've changed the way we do analysis and the social demographic and economic factors we collect for populations. So this question is harder to answer than certainly within my capability of answering at the moment. But what do we see? So this is the NDNS that closest relates to when I joined the civil service, 2000 and 2001. And in that, we saw much the same picture as I presented on the second slide. We see saturated fats above above recommendations, but when we compare them with the most recent NDNS, we do see some reduction. So saturated fat has gone in the right direction. It's come down. We see really profound reductions in trans fatty acids. And that's been due to the amazing work of industry just removing trans fatty acids from the food chain. For those of you who don't know, trans fatty acids increase the risk of heart disease substantially. And our UK industry has done really well in just taking them out of the food chain. But we don't see any real differences in sugar intake. Sugar intake has remained much the same. Fiber intake has remained much the same. John just mentioned the success of salt. That has come down. And fruit and vegetable intake has remained the same. So in that time, I'll talk about the myriad of policy interventions in a minute. But over the last 20 years, we've managed to kind of maintain a quite bad situation. It could have got worse over the last 20 years, which is one thing we absolutely could have got worse when you think about the changes that have happened in the food industry and in society, but we haven't seen vast improvements. So 20 years ago, for the NDNS, we used to think about, we used to present data for in relation to poverty, in relation to benefits. So were people receiving benefits or not? So not in the same way it's presented now, so this is one of the issues. So looking 20 years ago, what did we see? We saw no difference in saturated fat intake by income, no difference in trans fatty acid intake, by benefits. Benefit recipients, however, were consuming higher levels of sugar. They were consuming lower levels of fiber. They were consuming higher levels of salt. And they were consuming fewer fruit and veg. So kind of similar patterns than what we see now. But then I want to think about, well, are they quantifiably different than they were 20 years ago? Has the situation improved for low-income people? And luckily, some academic groups have addressed that through secondary analysis of the NDNS. This is data coming from Jean Adams' group in Cambridge, where they looked at 3 ways of the NDNS, not quite the right time period for me, but it will do, to give a sense of what has happened, looking at between 1986, 87 up until 2008. And they present lots of analysis in this paper, but this is looking at the effect of socioeconomic grouping, and this time classified according to occupation. So this is using manual occupations as a shorthand for deprivation, which may or may not be true, I don't know. But basically the conclusion is that over the period of the NDNS, we have seen improvements in salt intake for all socioeconomic groups. And the gap between the higher levels of occupation and manual occupations has actually closed. And salt has been one of the primary drivers of that. So we have seen dietary improvement, and this paper draws conclusion about improvements in that the gap between the most affluent and the least affluent has improved in terms of salt and fruit and veg intake. This is another analysis coming out of an Italian group. Interestingly, they're on the NDNS. Why are they analysing the NDNS? But that's another question. And this looks at diet in terms of DASH score. DASH is a diet that was established to try and reduce the risk of heart disease. It's a diet that's high in fruit and veg, it's relatively low in sodium, it's high in fiber, and I can't remember all the other things. But a higher DASH score means a healthier diet. So this looked at DASH score according to income. So the open circles are the lowest income group, and the upside down triangles are the highest income group. And what you see over time is that all income groups have improved their diets. They are doing better they were doing better in 2016 than they were in 2009. So all income groups do better. And I can't quite tell if it's narrowed. I don't think it has in this analysis. But the commentary of the paper, very much like the Jean Adams paper, refers to sodium as being one of the drivers. of this overall improvement in dietary score. So as John says, maybe sodium reduction policies have been a huge success for us all. So nutrients are one thing, energy intake, the amount of calories we're consuming is another thing. And that's actually quite hard to get a handle on because we have issues with all of the surveys to do with underreporting. And that degree of underreporting, as Susan Jebb told us a long, long time ago, perhaps 25 years ago, I can't remember, that overreporting is related to body weight. If you're living with obesity, you're more likely to underreport your calorie intake than if you are of a healthy weight. We also have problems with accounting for food bought from takeaways, deliveries, and so on, food we eat out of the home, and then we have problems with something called food balance sheets, which assesses the food of a population according to what's imported, what's produced, and what's wasted, and the difference is the balance, what we're consuming. So we have different data sources that may help us on calorie intake. I don't think they do very much, by the way. So this is a paper from the London School of Hygiene. This estimates calorie consumption per capita from 2 different sources. The orange is from food balance sheets data, and this goes from 1960s to the 2020, so a really long time period. And according to the food balance sheet data, our calorie estimate per capita has gone up. If you look at household food surveys, it's gone down. So diametrically opposed results. And it doesn't actually make any sense that it's gone down. And I'll talk about why that is in a moment. Why that is because the population is living with obesity. Over 60% of us are obese or overweight. The amount of calories you need to sustain your body weight is directly dependent on your size. Bigger people, people who are more overweight, require more calories than lean people just to maintain themselves. And this is, I actually did my PhD on energy expenditure, and I would have recognized this graph from there, which just shows as you get bigger, your resting energy expenditure, there's a direct relationship with it. So it doesn't make sense that we could be consuming less calories because we've got a lot bigger over the last 20 years. And in the UK, we have lots of data to prove that. We have the Health Survey for England that pops around every few years and measures people's heights and weights. And since the 1990s, we've had an increase in the proportion of people who are obese. Both men and women, it's just gone up. We've got heavier. So we clearly are consuming more. And you can do an estimate of how much more by using an approach set out by the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition. I won't go through the approach, but it uses an isotope, doubly labeled water, to assess energy expenditure, which you can then use to assess energy intake if you know the height and weight of population. Public Health England published an assessment of this in 2018. And at the time, using the most recent height and weight data, we saw average calorie excesses for men of between 425 and 360 calories per day, and for women of around 300 calories a day, and excesses for children. That's a lot. And that tells you if you base your obesity policy on telling people to exercise a bit more, it won't work, because this is far more than you can alter your energy needs by running around the block a few times. So we know that the population overall is consuming more. So what about disparities in that? What's happening across the income ranges? And Health Survey for England doesn't always publish the right data to assess this. So I've just taken something from, compares 2004 2014 to 2019. And it looks at distribution of obesity by level of deprivation back in 2014 for men and women, and again for 2019. Now, what we see is that overall levels of obesity have gone up. We see that they have disproportionately gone up in the lowest income groups. And indeed, when you look at women, it's huge. There is now a clear socioeconomic gradient for both men and women in terms of levels of obesity. So calorie intake is socioeconomically constructed in this country. The more you are, if you're living in deprivation, you're more likely to be consuming excess calories than if you're living in a privileged situation. And we see similarly for children, socioeconomic patterning in body weight. This is data from the National Child Measurement Programme. We measure our children at the beginning of primary school and at the end of primary school. We see them gain weight over that period, and we see socioeconomic differences. So the red line are for children in the least deprived 10%, and the green line is the most deprived 10%, and you see a gap in reception and in primary school, and you see an increase over time. So I would never publish this data. I estimated it sitting in my back bedroom with a piece of paper just to get an idea of how much calorie excess has gone up over the last 20 years. And so if we just look at women, they're the easiest to look at, we see that average body weights have gone up from 64.6 kilos to 72. That's a 7.5 kilo difference over 20 years. It's huge. I was really surprised to see how big that number was. We've gained a lot of weight in 20 years. And therefore, our calorie excess has gone up a lot in 20 years. And my back-of-the-envelope estimate, not to be reproduced, is it's gone up from about 200 calories a day to about 340 calories per day. That's a lot. And again, these changes are bigger than you could exercise off easily and could not be accounted for by secular changes in physical activity. The difference for low-income groups will be bigger. So the secular change for low-income groups in terms of calorie consumption will be much bigger than this. So, to summarize, now and then, on average, we all have had poor diets over the last 20-year period. Our diets have not been aligned with recommendations, and our energy intakes have been too high. Now and then, income is associated and was associated with a worse diet and a greater degree of energy excess. But diets have improved a little bit for everybody, but not in terms of calories. That's got worse. So now turning to policy, I need to keep my eye on the time. So I am really proud to have been involved in lots and lots of policies over the years. I think the UK has been in a great position of doing a lot, but it's been a really hard task to tackle the poor diet of the nation. So if I think about it, in my career, we've had legislation on school food standards. Might not be properly implemented, but we do have legislation to control the food being offered to children in our primary and secondary schools. We have cooking embedded in the curriculum. It is there in the national curriculum. It may not always be implemented, but it is there. We give free school lunches to infants. We give vitamins, minerals, fruit and milk vouchers to low-income families with children under 5. We have banned advertising of unhealthy foods during children's television. We've got standards for public food procurement. This legislation is much more than many countries have. I do WHO work, I know that very well. We have voluntary approaches to improving diet. We've got the said salt reduction program that I'll talk about a bit more. And we've been through various approaches of working with industry. We had for 2 years the public health responsibility deal, in which industries pledged to do things and then reported on how they did. It wasn't a success. We need to remember it wasn't a success and not do it again. We've had voluntary removal of trans fatty acids from products. That's been successful. And we have front of pack traffic lights on products. They tend to be appear on the healthier products, but we have a voluntary scheme for front of pack traffic lights. We introduced the soft drinks industry levy, which I'll talk more about in a minute. That's been a good thing. We've got out-of-home calorie labelling, and we've just banned placement of high salt, fat, sugar foods at store checkouts and at the end of aisle. We've got treatment programs, the diabetes prevention program. We had for a while a national weight management program, but that lost its money. And we have had for the last 7 years a structured program that mirrors salt of sugar reduction that I'll talk about in a minute. So there's been a lot, and it's been, may not seem that much for 20 years, but there has been a lot. And throughout the whole time, we've been running marketing campaigns. The government has spent a lot of money on marketing campaigns. And remember that quite often, companies will say to government, all you need to do is to tell people to exercise more and make a few healthy choices. And government has done their bit in trying to do that. They spent a great deal of taxpayers' money on it, and it's very hard. But there's been a lot of healthy marketing over the years. But I just wanted to, I have these sitting on my shelf at home, and I just wanted to say, but we have to accept there is a limit to telling people what to do to support change. These are systematic reviews that I was involved in centuries ago in 1998. It was a series of them that looked at the effect of educational interventions, so peer support, cooking classes, shopping lessons, whole myriads of different approaches, paying people incentives to improve their nutrition. And all of them were successful in one way. They improved people's knowledge and they improved people's intention. But none of them were able to sustain behaviour change. And the literature hasn't changed significantly on this. Educational interventions are great, but they won't bring huge change because, as we've heard this morning, our food environment is really super saturated in this country. If I think about the last 20 years, our high streets have completely changed. Our food high streets are now super saturated with food outlets. There are a lot of fast food chains on our high streets. I live in a posh bit of London. That's got very nice food outlets, different from many other areas, but they're still food outlets. They're still purveying a lot of calories. We have very deep price promotion within our shops. We have a huge amount of advertising. We have sponsorship of our football events by food companies. We have a huge amount of delivery. Our environment is super saturated with food. So it's very hard to stick to your intention. As one of the speakers said this morning, most of us know what we should be doing and want to feed our children well. But when you're zooming around that supermarket and you see 2 for 1 on some lovely, gorgeous, indulgent product, it's very hard not to buy it and your intention gets undermined. So all of this is what we need to do something about if we want to try and turn the dial on our diet and actually see things improve as opposed to just stabilize. So I'm going to reflect on salt. You have to be very old to remember this now. This is Sid the Sug that the FSA used about 18 years ago to support the salt reduction campaign. And the salt reduction campaign was based on advice from our Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition. And I can't tell you how important that advice was. The salt reduction programme was very heavily challenged. We managed to avoid court, but by the skin of our teeth, every element of it was challenged, and it was very difficult. It's involved setting, with industry, voluntary targets for salt reduction that have ratcheted down over the years. And we have seen some remarkable things. We've seen our breakfast cereals that's now about 30% less salty than they were in 2004. We've seen bread saltiness reduced by even more. We've seen many products that you don't even think of as being salty have taken salt out. And the programme has been supported by things like restricting advertising of high salt, fat, sugar foods, front-of-pack food labelling, school food standards, all of which set limits on the level of salt in foods. Public Health England did an analysis, which we published in 2020, looking at how industry are doing, and this was against the third wave of targets, and we saw, actually, industry are doing pretty good. They achieved the majority, many of the targets. So the industry had achieved 43 out of the 52 average targets retailers had. Manufacturers were doing less well. They'd met 18 out of 52. Whole swathes of products were doing well: bread, breakfast cereals, rice products, processed potatoes, crisps, and so on and so forth. But some products were not doing so well: processed meats. And the out-of-home sector, that's fast food chains and so on, were meeting their targets, which are somewhat higher than those set for retailers. So lots of good progress by industry. But if we look at intakes of salt, what we see is that the programme achieved very good reductions in the early days, but over more recent years, it's kind of flatlined, despite industry achieving waves and waves of salt reduction. So the question is why, and I want to come back to that in a minute. Before I get to salt again, I'm just going to talk about sugar. So the sugar reduction programme was built on the salt reduction programme. It's a voluntary programme and was based on advice, again, from the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition. Again, this committee's work was incredibly important because the salt reduction programme and policies that stemmed from the efforts to reduce sugar have been immensely challenged. And the ability to have this robust, very detailed scientific evidence base has really stood the country in very good stead in being able to defend what we were doing. At the same time as SACN publishing the sugar reduction programme, which recommended that the nation needed to cut its sugar intake because too much sugar increases the risk of consuming too many calories. It's associated with a higher risk of type 2 diabetes. Sugary drinks are particularly associated with high energy consumption and risk of weight gain. Public Health England did a how-to report at the same time and recommended a raft of policies that were really there to address the structural drivers of poor diet. So they recommended reducing price promotions, extending bans on high sugar food advertising, reducing portion sizes and the sugar content of foods contributing to sugar intakes, and taxing or putting a levy on high sugar products. And one of the key things they said is, I was there, that this all needs to happen at once. A piecemeal, picking one or two of these things won't change the dial. And when the work of PHE is criticised, I think it's very important to remember the government cherry-picked from this list and did not do what PHE said. And one of the key things we said is that you need to move beyond information and a bit of food labelling, because a bit of food labelling is a very good thing, but it won't change the dial. Because you're a health seeker if you look at a food label, and not many people are health seekers. So they then followed various obesity strategies. Chapter 1 of the Childhood Obesity Strategy, it was it got a bit watered down in the last minute. You can see the earlier draft that was released on the Guardian website, leaked to the Guardian. But we got soft drinks industry levy, we got a sugar reduction program, and we had a promise of advertising and promotional restrictions. So just moving on to talk about the sugar reduction program. This challenged industry to take 20% out of sugar out of the top contributors to sugar intake by 2020. 22 years ago. The most recent data has not yet been published. I hope it will be published soon. So I'm going to talk about data that PHE published in 2020. And in that data, we saw that if this was 1 year before the end of the programme, so we would expect to see a 15% reduction in sugar levels in these foods, and we didn't. We saw a 3% reduction, so the programme was not on target. But if you look beyond the headline data, you see really good levels of sugar reduction in breakfast cereals and yogurts, about a 13% reduction. Medium level reductions in morning goods, those are croissants and things, spreads and cakes and ice creams, but really nothing, very low levels in biscuits, confectionery and puddings. But the immensely successful thing has been the SIDL, the soft drink industry level levy, which in this analysis resulted in a 43% reduction in sugar levels in drinks. Huge success. That's the biggest change I've ever seen in my career. Really massive. And industry stepped up and did it. Nobody wanted to pay the levy. It was bad PR. Well, some companies decided to pay the levy. So if you look in the PHE reports, you can see what individual businesses are doing. And if you just look at breakfast cereals, you can compare Kellogg's with Weetabix, with PepsiCo, and so on. And you can look at how all the retailers are doing on their own brand products. And actually, you see really good levels of reduction for most companies, breakfast cereals. Do see two notable exceptions for the retailers who, according to this data, have done nothing. I hope in the final report they will have done something, but somehow I'd be surprised. So just looking at the levy a bit more, because this talk is supposed to be about inequalities, we see that the sugary drinks levy has caused changes in the level of sugary drinks purchases by all socioeconomic groups. So all socioeconomic groups have benefited to the same extent, and that's a miracle. That never happens in any other nutrition intervention unless you directly give poor families food. And that speaks to the power of something that is structured to benefit everybody, not just people like you and me. So why has voluntary reformulation not improved diets? Remember, we've seen no significant change in salt consumption in recent years. We haven't yet published the next wave of NDNS to look at sugar, but we probably won't have seen significant changes. And that's despite many parts of industry really stepping up to this challenge of reducing salt and sugar in their products. And the answer is in this slide. So if you look at the bottom box, we've seen massive reductions in the sugar coming out of sugary drinks, breakfast cereals, and yogurts. But that has been completely counteracted by increased sales of high sugar products, i.e. chocolate confectionery and sweet confectionery. not only are these products not reformulated at all, and I accept it would have been really hard for them to do 20%, but they could have done 5%, they have sold massively more product. And that has undermined the reformulation programs. And a similar analysis would show the same for salt, that just more product being sold has undermined reformulation. And we need to remember this when we're designing future policies. There are other reasons why the reformulation programs haven't delivered major changes. This is data from Access to Nutrition Index that looks at world companies, and it hasn't projected that well, and looks at the healthfulness of their portfolios. And it measures it against the Health Star system, which is like the nutrient profile, which assesses products in terms of their salt, saturated fat, and sugar content, and balances that against their fruit and veg and fiber content. And you see that overwhelmingly, all of the leading global companies have an unhealthy portfolio. Their portfolio is, in general, maybe I'm making too much of a sweeping statement, unhealthy. Susan Jebb has been involved in this analysis. This has done much the same for company products in the UK. And we see over 4 years, very little improvement in the overall portfolio of any of the companies in this list, all our major companies. This is despite them telling us about all their healthy options. Healthy options only help people who go and look for healthy options. You have to improve the big selling products to help improve people's diets. So I can name companies now because I no longer work for the government. So if you're Kellogg's, you need to improve your big sellers. Your little breakfast cereals that a few health seekers choose are never going to have any effect. And this is the same analysis, but this time looking by food group, which again shows very little improvement. We've also seen governments stand away from things that might affect the sales of unhealthy products. This is Jamie Oliver outside number 10, complaining that government had announced it intended to pull back from the promised advertising restrictions and the promised promotional restrictions. And he was right to complain. One of the reasons set out for pulling back from buy one, get one free type restrictions on unhealthy products was that it was going to make poor people poorer. It was bad for poor people's budgets. That's incorrect. Promotions lead to you buying more than you intend, and certainly lead you to buying less healthy products than you would intend. So actually putting that on, and it's a really big effect, 20% of what we buy is on promotions, independent of our socioeconomic background. So we all like a bargain, but none of us are really having a bargain. We're just buying more and spending more because of those promos. We have, as I mentioned earlier, though, government has introduced the place-based promotional ban. And government also stood back from extending the advertising restrictions. This is really bad for low-income groups because families living in low-income households see more commercials. And those commercials are for unhealthy foods. So standing back from the extending advertising restrictions is very bad for the nation's diet. Another thing that's led to things not improving is our drift towards eating out more, having takeaways and deliveries. And the reason that this is from a Public Health England report, but what this shows is if you buy a pizza from a retailer, its average calorie content will be about 800 odd calories. If you buy one from a fast food chain, the average calorie content will be over 1,000 calories. Food you buy from this sector is more calorific. It costs more and it's more calorific. It's bad for the nation's waistline, and we've drifted towards buying more and more food from this sector. This is data from Kantar, who published data on how industry are doing. And what we've seen is that the sector still is in growth. Over the last 2 years, England is here in the middle, eating lunch and dinner out occasions have increased over the last 2 years. The industry has bounded back from the pandemic and is doing very well. Thank you very much. These guys also are doing very well. Thank you very much. So in the pandemic, we saw a massive growth in deliveries, and that is here to stay. And if you think about that food, I always think these delivery companies are the most disruptive thing I've seen in the food chain in my career. They're having a massive effect. They're doing a great deal of direct-to-consumer marketing, and a lot of the food bought from this Kantar data on the bottom is bought on promo. People perceive it to be cheap. They perceive it to be a money-saving thing. It is not. It's much cheaper to buy your pizza from a retailer or even make your own. And it's very expensive to buy it from an out-of-home chain, even though you often perceive it's a bargain because you've been offered 20% off. And on a wet Friday in Bradford, when you get that message into your phone, it's very hard to say no. And as much education as you like is not going to help people say no. And we've got huge increases in the density of out-of-home businesses across the UK. I can't go away without talking about food insecurity, because obviously that's the theme of today. This is data from the Food Foundation. It looks at what's happening in terms of food security. And what we see is that food insecurity, as everybody has said this morning, is getting worse in the UK. All I would say is be very careful about shorthanding what food insecurity means. It shouldn't be taken as a shorthand for many of our families not having enough to eat. They very well are eating too much of really poor quality food, but eating too much. But the food insecurity, the economic crisis that we are beginning to live through, we don't know what effect that will have on people's diets. We know it's affecting food insecurity. We know people are having to make difficult choices. In the last recession, we saw people trading down. So we saw them buying cheaper cuts of meat and things like that. That really had very little effect on their diet. This time, because it's deeper, we may see dietary effects, but we don't yet know that. So overall, my reflections, I've got a few more slides. The UK has done some great work in terms of nutrition policy. And reformulation, soft drinks industry levy, advertising clause, etc., have been really good, and I'm really proud to have been involved in them. But the net effect has been probably to hold our diets relatively the same. We have not achieved great dietary improvement for anybody, including our low-income groups. And the situation could worsen going forward when we look at food trends. When we look at what's going on, the situation could worsen. And this idea that this is about people just making bad choices is not fair to people. Their choices are being influenced by the environment we live in and what is being driven to us all the time, literally on mopeds, but also all the advertising that is now personalized. It's so sophisticated. So it's a very long list. But to just summarize the problems as I see them, salt and sugar is voluntary. I actually think the UK has really tested voluntary programs. We've seen a lot of industry collaborate with them, but quite a lot of industry completely ignore them. More time, more voluntary programs is unlikely to change that. So I probably think that now is the moment to legislate around compositional controls of food. Given that we have a deregulatory government, I think that's fairly unlikely. But my view is more of the same is not going to change anything. Really need to address, if we want to see policy deliver change, sales of high salt, fat, sugar foods, and the drift towards takeaways and deliveries. And the out-of-home industry, with the exception of calorie labelling, is largely off the hook for everything. It's very much painted as an occasional treat. It isn't an occasional treat. We do it all the time. And businesses need to be incentivized to completely reshape their portfolios, not introduce a few healthy options. When it's really hard to find a healthy choice isn't an option. And the supportive policies, where there is legislation, it jolly well needs enforcing. We don't need new school food legislation. We just need the legislation we've got to be enforced. We don't necessarily even need a new front-of-pack labelling scheme for food. We just need it to move from a voluntary scheme to a mandated scheme, because without that, we won't get the people who won't do it to do it. We need government to take forward promotional advertising controls, and we need to think about those in terms of brand advertising and sponsorship controls. And we need to watch out for health washing. I was incensed during the pandemic to see a lot of free publicity for pizza companies giving pizzas to the NHS. We're currently seeing a lot of products that I'm uncomfortable with ending up in our food banks. We are seeing sponsorship of our sport, and nobody questions this. It's just advertising. It's not a great thing. But we also have a clear tension between the economics of our food industry and their need to grow to sell more product versus the health of the nation. And the intertwining of those things makes it very difficult to find a way forward. And this, I think, was illustrated to me from my last job for government. I was the expert witness. Kellogg's took the government to court because they were trying to have breakfast cereals not classified as high sugar foods because they said they were consumed with milk. And the judge was having none of this. He said you can't rely on a product such as milk to pretend that a high sugar breakfast cereal is healthy. I would really recommend, I love the judgment, I'd really recommend people read it. But to me, this says the economic impact, potential impact of restricting promotions is big for business. And if you're prepared to risk your corporate reputation by going to court on something like classifying Frosties, trying to say Frosties are healthy, that says something to me about how serious the sales are for business success. Anyway, I was very pleased government won. So in conclusion, education and information and supporting people won't bring change. It will help individuals, so some of the projects we've seen this morning will help individuals, but it won't address the problem that over 60% of us are obese or overweight and consuming too many calories. We can't afford to support those one-to-one interventions in a meaningful way. Voluntary measures have been well tested, but are unevenly taken up and are not having a big enough effect. There is a stark conflict between the economic needs of businesses to grow and dietary improvement for the population. And business is really important for government. It brings us lots of tax, lots of revenue. It employs lots of people. Really good source of exports. They're really powerful. But that means they've got skin in the game of trying to find solutions for the population out of this. NGOs are really important in this, and health campaigners like Jamie Oliver. More of the same won't address problems. And one of my chief reflections over the last 20 years is, oh my gosh, even though I'm really proud of it, it's been really painful and slow policy progress. And that's not the fault of the civil service teams. So Henry Dimbleby said, we need to escape the junk food cycle. He is so right. We need to stop selling so much high salt, fat sugar foods, and more of it will only make the situation worse and worse. We need legislation, and we need that legislation to be enforced. We need an even playing field for all of the food industry, including the out-of-home and delivery sector. We need to address the volumes of unhealthy food being sold, and that probably means taxation, advertising, and marketing controls on products and brands that drive large-scale change, and particularly to support those living in deprivation. And it's a really critical moment for all of this, because all of the current obesity and nutrition policies we have are currently up for review. Liz Truss, really anti the nanny state, put them up for review. That review is still going on. Everything is at risk. And she very much had the rhetoric, it's all about personal responsibility. While it's really hard to exercise that personal responsibility on a weekend in Bradford when you're being bombarded with food left, right, and centre. So to achieve this, I think, is really hard. But we could do it if we were braver as a nation. Current political climate feels a bit unlikely, but I'm hopeful that things will improve. So finally, just to acknowledge a few people. Civil servants, the nutrition teams in government, never get any thanks or praise. But I want to recognise a huge amount of work all of this has been, and my policy colleagues in the Department of Health. SACA members, Alan Jackson, Anne Prentice, and Ian Young have had a thankless task in chairing SACA over the years. The evidence of the committee is hugely dependable. In that Callows case, SACA was the foundation of winning the case. NDNS contractors, NatSen, Elsie Widdowson Laboratories, and now Cambridge. I should have had Cantor on this list. Obesity and nutrition NGOs and collaborative colleagues in food businesses. And this is my team, so thank you very much.